Hello, everybody. So today we're going to do part 2 of my series on the Black Death. I'll link to part 1 below. In part 1, we talked about the disease itself. So we talked about the mortality rate, the types of the disease, how it spread, that sort of thing. So this time we're going to talk about the social, political, economic, and religious consequences of the Black Death. Because in many ways it did fundamentally transform the West. And I think before we get into this, just kind of something to point out. As you can see on this map, the first outbreak was in the 1340s, 1350s. And the thing to keep in mind is this was just the first outbreak. You would have outbreaks every couple of years to every decade or two. And while I don't think any of these were as big as the original, what it meant was things didn't really go back to how they were before. I think it took something like 200 years for Europe's population to recover to what it was pre-plague levels. So while you can say in the aftermath of the Black Death, reactionary forces tried to restore the status quo, it just didn't really work out, as the change was more or less confirmed by subsequent outbreaks. So a lot of historians like to see this as the transitional phase between the medieval period and early modernity. Now, as I said, the plague, you have to keep in mind, went on for over 100 years in various forms. Because generally speaking, the cutoff very roughly for early modernity is 1500, and this is about 150 years before. However, kind of the social change that happened during this time period is what, like I said, altered society and allowed early modernity to start. And once again, these are not absolute terms. These are just kind of general terms that historians use. It's a bit like antiquity, which is kind of seen to end with the fall of the Roman Empire. It's just kind of a shorthand. So if someone says antiquity, you know, oh, they're talking about Greece and Rome, or I guess classical period or something like that. So what were the impacts of the Black Death upon Europe? Now, it's kind of funny, and I hate to use a Marvel movie reference, but it's literally what would have happened if Thanos' plan had succeeded. Because if you haven't seen the Marvel movies, Thanos' plan was to kill half of the life in the universe. He wanted to get the Infinity Gauntlet, he would snap his fingers, and half the life in the universe would disappear. The idea being that the remainder would be able to thrive. And so let's just think about this for a minute. Depending on where you are in Europe, in the span of a couple years, 30 to 70% of the population was just gone. And it's hard to even imagine what that would look like. So maybe let's just give a couple examples. So the first thing is families tended to be a lot larger back there, at least in terms of extended family. And within a village, it was fairly common for a lot of the people to be fourth or fifth cousins, or to have some distant relation. So what wound up happening is when you have 50% of the population die, the remaining 50% inherits all of their stuff. And like I said, this was uneven. There was a case in Sweden where there was only one girl who was left over after a village, we'll say 100 people died, so she inherited the entire village by herself. And so overnight, you had a large proportion of the peasantry who went from barely eking out a subsistence living to being minor landholders. So maybe you would have 10 acres or something like that. I don't really know how much an acre is, but we're just going to use this for example's sake. And then you inherit another 20 to 30 acres in the same town. And now you're in a much better financial situation. You have a lot more social status. And what's kind of funny is you get to a point in time where people are starting to turn down inheritances. And this is partially just because maybe you inherit 30 acres within your town, but then you inherit 10 on the other side of England, and they're I don't want to have to manage that. I have to pay taxes on that. How the hell am I going to go across the country to farm there? So you have this thing where inheritance goes to almost being a burden in some cases, especially since there's a death tax that has to be paid to the nobility. Another kind of funny side effect of this is, while the dramatic decline in peasants means there's not really as many people to sow the fields, also just the general social chaos, People are running away, people are moving, people don't know what the hell's going on. So the fields are not plowed. If the fields are plowed, then the wheat rots in the field. However, you suddenly have a lot of farm animals because the cows per capita, the chickens per capita, the pigs per capita double basically overnight. So you have this weird scenario where meat becomes much cheaper and grain becomes much more expensive, which is something you don't see very often historically. So you see this large increase in the base wealth of the peasantry, and as peasants get more and more money, they start to want more rights, more influence on how society is governed. Now there's another half to this, which is because so much of the labor pool has died off, wages naturally go up. I mean, this is the same for pretty much, this is supply and demand. So while the demand has gone down, the supply has gone down faster. So if we're looking at the price curve, supply going down faster than demand means that price goes up, especially since the system's kind of broken down at this point. So a peasant who harvests might be worth 3 to 4 times as much economically as they were before. This is especially true for skilled tradesmen. And you see a rise of the guilds during this time period and kind of an emergence of a middle and upper middle class more so than before. Because as I keep repeating, and it's just a very important point, the plague didn't hit like universally. In particular, it hit cities normally worse. So let's say there was like, I don't know, 100 coopers in a city or something like that, and maybe like 80 of them died. The remaining 20 can sell their barrels for like much, much more than they used to be able to. And if they've gone from being like somewhat poor to being fairly well off, they're going to want more influence in government. And so wages dramatically increased. And this is kind of where we see the end of serfdom. Serfdom was never really as big in the West as it became in the East, but basically serfdom is you're tied to the land and you work for the lord in exchange for protection and the ability to keep a certain amount of your crops. And it's kind of like a halfway point, I guess, between slavery and being a freeholder. Now, when this happened, the peasants were like, okay, so we're going to maintain the same crappy deal despite the fact that our labor is worth 3 or 4 times as much. No, we don't want that anymore. What we want is we want cash wages, or we want to keep a larger percentage of our produce or something to that effect. And we see more and more of a moneyed economy emerge during this time period because supply chains have just broken down and the traditional arrangements have broken down, and just dealing with cash money is easier. So what peasants will often do is they'll go to their lord and like, you got to pay me more. And if they say no, then they just pick up and move somewhere else. Even if they have land in the local area, if your village is just completely devastated, there's not much point. Like it's like you can own all this land in like the middle of, I don't know, Wyoming or something. But if it's nowhere near a road system and it's nowhere near a town, like what's really the point? It's not really economically useful. And so people would just go to the next town over and they'd go to the lord or his representatives and go, you have to pay me 3 times as much as the other guy did. And the lords wouldn't really have that much choice because they need somebody to harvest the fields. Now, obviously, the upper class tried to prevent this. They tried to pass laws to prevent people from moving. None of this was really enforceable. They would occasionally kill people to try to set an example. One of the big things that undermined it is the nobles acting in individual self-interest. So, I mean, it was all well and good that theoretically the system would be preserved, but they still needed somebody to plow their fields. So they'd support this law, but they'd also be paying peasants extra money to go there and do stuff. Within the cities, housing prices obviously fell a lot. You had a big influx of people from the countryside into the cities, which once again created more kind of supply issues. Once again, the whole supply period, I think there was multiple famines during this period. I mean, if you think like the disruption from coronavirus is bad, imagine, like I said, 50 to 60% of the population vanishing overnight. Generally speaking, what I've seen is the class of society that wound up the worst off after this was the nobility, because it gave a lot more bargaining power and financial power to the peasantry, and it dramatically weakened their position. Now, another aspect of this is nobles weren't really spared from the great mortality either. The lecture series I listened to was saying in some cases, I think it was in Barcelona, there was a council of nobles who helped to govern the city, and there was 100 of them, and like 80 of them died. And at that point, there's so few left. How do you even find people to replace the others? Like, they couldn't even find people to replace it. The governance duties that was on 100 people is now on 20. And it's like, what do you even do? And there were other cases where, like, the entire parliament, or whatever you want to call it, would die. And then there's effectively no central government. And the nobility had died out to a large extent, so it was hard to find people to replace these posts. So they kind of more and more had to rely on guilds or middle class people or stuff like that to kind of fill in the gaps that had emerged. So like I said, this relative decline in the power of the nobility meant that serfdom was basically over at this point. And we see the emergence of a somewhat more economically equal society, but this isn't reflected in the politics. And that's why you have a bunch of different revolts. You had one in Florence from the guildless. You had, obviously, the peasants' revolt in England. You just had a bunch of revolts breaking out around as the peasantry wanted a new deal. And not just the peasantry, but like the emerging middle class, the tradesmen, merchants became a lot wealthier during this time period. In part because people suddenly had a lot more disposable income, and you could now afford stuff. You could afford like silk and goods from the Orient because you just inherited a ton of money. And I mean, you might as well spend some of it on yourself, because who knows when the next great mortality is coming. So that's kind of like the economic changes and the political changes that happened during this time period. So the other aspect of this is the religious changes. And these were not immediately obvious, but they were really, really significant. So the clergy had at least taken the same percentage of casualties, maybe more casualties than the lower and noble classes did during this time period. In part because monasteries are kind of ideal breeding grounds, especially when the monks they would serve as kind of makeshift hospitals. So the monks or the nuns would take in plague victims and try to help them. And there you have all these people in a confined space. And you would just have complete devastation of monasteries, which had served as these centers of learning that had provided all these community services and stuff. So a lot of them just disappeared basically overnight. And then we get to the impact it had on the wider church. So when we're looking at this time period, what do you think the good clergy were doing, the pious holy men who really believed in their cause and in service to the public, and those who were corrupt and didn't really believe that much in their mission as much as their own enrichment? Well, the answer is the good clergy were out, they were offering last rites, they were still holding masses despite all the troubles that happened. They were administering to their flock. So because of that, they were the ones who disproportionately died off. While a lot of the clergy who fled or stayed in their palaces didn't die at quite as high a rate. So you have basically most of the good clergy dying off in a really short period of time, and the people who are left not being the best of the bunch. You also have the issue of whenever there's a shortage, a huge shortage of something, how do you kind of deal with that? I mean, there's a couple ways. One is to increase recruitment. So I think they established, I'm not sure if they really had seminaries during this time period, but they established more schools for priests. But the other way you deal with it is you lower requirements. So like a big thing in Canada that they're very smug about is when you do war games, the average Canadian soldier generally performs better than the average American soldier. Although, to be fair, the Canadians have to borrow equipment from America to even do the war games. And this is a big point of pride for Canada. But keep in mind, Canada's military is per capita much smaller. I mean, obviously it's going to be smaller because Canada's a smaller country, but there's fewer soldiers per capita. So Canada can be a lot more selective. Of the people who apply, we maybe take the top 10%, whereas in the U.S. they have a much larger army, so they take the top 30%. So if you select the better quality people from a large pool, that's generally speaking going to give you quality at the expense of quantity. And at this point in time, like 50 to 60% of the clergy had died out, and they were just like, we need to fill this immediately. So they just basically, I'm sure it's exaggerated to a certain extent, but just anyone who wanted to be a priest, they're like, okay, we're just going to rush you through. You can kind of figure this out on the job experience. We don't really have time for an internship. You can be a priest. You can be a priest. You can be a bishop. And they just massively lowered standards and just shoved as many people through programs and ordination as possible. And this isn't even really a criticism because you need people to administer the sacraments to the laity, to the public. And it was a really bad position the church was in, but the result of that was you had a massive decrease in the average quality of the clergy. And a lot of the people who would joined for the wrong reasons. See, the church had become immensely wealthy during this time period because it's fairly common during the Middle Ages to leave part of your wealth to the church. What would happen to a lot of churches is you would leave a certain donation and they would say a mass or offer prayers for your soul in purgatory. So that was kind of one of the ways priests made money, is they were able to take payments for masses a couple times a week. And that would kind of be a lot of their stipend. So I would imagine that would either be they'd mention your name during their normal weekly mass, or they'd conduct a private one for you, or when they're doing prayers, they list all the people off. And sometimes people would give like huge amounts of money, and they do this for decades or like 100 years. So particularly in an environment where everyone thought they were going to die, and death was a very immediate concern, people left large donations to the church. And once again, if they inherited like some useless land or stuff, they just give that to the church. So you have this scenario in which most of the really good clergy die off. You have to massively rush through a lot of people of dubious intelligence and moral character, and you have a massive increase in the worldly wealth of the church. And this is like a recipe for disaster. And once again, this isn't necessarily the church's fault. This didn't come from some sort of fundamental corruption. That's just kind of where the dice fell. And that really kind of sets the stage for the abuses you see during the next century that eventually leads up to the Reformation. There's also a lot of, I'm not sure how to put it exactly. There's a certain loss in faith, not necessarily in God or the supernatural, but in the abilities of the church, because the church wasn't really able to prevent the Great Mortality. And if you're going to have like repeated apocalypses and your main means of supernatural mediation doesn't seem to be able to do anything about it, that's kind of a bad sign. And a lot of people took the Great Mortality to be chastisement from God for their sins or the sins of the church, either like just general societal wide problems or specifically the church. So like I said, you have this scenario where a lot of people were kind of disappointed in the way the church had reacted. The good clergy had died off. They had to bring in a bunch of questionable people, and the church was suddenly much more wealthy. And you can kind of see what's leading up here. And a lot of particularly once the population started to recover, a lot of the clergy were like, well, we're used to a certain standard of living, so let's start doing indulgence selling and a lot of other shenanigans to keep the money flowing, let the green roll in, as it were. And so that's where we start to get kind of the early modern period. We see a gradual decline after the Reformation of the power of the church. You see a decline in the power of the nobility at the expense of the middle class and the king. And this is really kind of the end of the medieval period. Once again, I mean, the end of the medieval period lasted over 100 years. But it's a bit like the fall of Rome, in which case a lot of stuff just kind of happened during the time period and things were chaotic. So while it seemed like a very long period of time, I don't know how much. So I hope that kind of explains some of the social and economic consequences of the Black Death. I think it's important to keep in mind also, just kind of as a concluding statement, there was a third outbreak in India and China at the 19th century. And the bacteria is still very much around. You have a couple people who die a year from it. The great fear, though, is I think there's a strain that has absorbed some aspects of E. coli and I think maybe Ebola and is a lot more virulent. The newer forms of it are less lethal, which actually makes it more dangerous because it's not going to burn itself out as quickly. Finally, you have the scenario where there might be another version of this in the future that is resistant to antibiotics. And that's really scary because the Black Death is fortunately a bacterial infection. So if somebody gets it today, and a lot of people who get it still die, because why would anyone expect them to have the Black Death in like in the current year? But it is treatable with basic antibiotics. And if it becomes immune to basic antibiotics, I mean, this could be really, really bad. I don't know if it's really going to happen, but it's just kind of something interesting to keep in mind. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found that educational, and I'll do some more history videos real soon.